Hello everyone, welcome to today's class. This chapter 10 is about externalities, and with this we start the part 4 of this book. And this part, which includes 3 chapters, is about the economics of public sector. So in this chapter and in the coming 2 more chapters, we will be talking about public sector, and that's basically how government has an influence, or how government interacts with the market, or how government is involved in market. These topics are mostly related to macroeconomics, if you want to put it into comparison between micro and macro. So these are the topics that matters for the government basically. And if you are interested in public sector, these are the topics which you might find interesting, and possibly in future you can also concentrate on these topics if you have interest in it. The next chapter is about public good and common resources, and the following one is about the design of the tax system. So these 3 chapters will be the part 4 of the book, which is about the economics of the public sector. Okay, now let's start with this topic of this chapter. It's called Externalities, and I will quickly explain it in simple term. Is what externality is basically so far we have been talking about a market and market efficiency, when on one side there is a buyer and on the other side is the producer, and then they are both involved in a transaction, and that basically we see like this transaction, if it's based on the law of demand and supply, and if it's the equilibrium, and when the market is in equilibrium, so both buyer and sellers, they are happy, or their surplus is maximized. So that was what we have learned so far. But what externality tells us is that this market system is not always a good system. It might also affect other people who are not directly involved in the market, or who are not directly impacted by a transaction. And throughout this chapter we will see a lot of example what I mean by that, but mainly it is the external effect of the market, or the external effect of a market system. It could be a positive external effect, so it could be something good, or it could be a negative external thing, which we will discuss more as a positive externalities and negative externalities. Okay, so let's go into what are the main topics. We will talk about what is externality, and how externalities affect market outcome. So we have been talking about market efficiencies, and we will see why externalities is an efficient market outcome. And as I said in the beginning, this chapter is about the public sector, so we will also see how government could possibly solve such externalities. So what are the tools and policies that a government could use to solve the problem of externalities. And externality is also known as a market failure, or it's like something that the market has failed to account for. So that's why, as we have said, as one of the principle of economics is that government can sometimes improve the market outcome. So government sometimes can influence the market outcome, or the government is allowed to intervene in a market in order to solve such problem or to make the market outcome efficient. So one of way of doing this is government influence the market outcome through the public policies, and especially if there is a market failure such as negative externalities. And last, we will also talk about how people could solve this problem of externality by themselves, and why sometimes private solution does not always work. So as we have said in previous chapters, markets are usually a good way to organize economy activity. So it's basically the market system or capitalism, and as we said that it's a best system in which resources are allocated in efficient way, and through organizing the market activity or economic activity through market is a good way of organizing the economy. The other extreme will be the controlled market system, such as communism, in which a government decides about how much to produce and what to produce and who will consume that products. So on one extreme is the communist regime of governing the economy, and on the other extreme is the pure market system. And here we are talking about the market system, that the market system is usually a better way of organizing the economic activities of a country. So as a quick review, when there is no market failure, so that's one assumption, then the competitive market outcome is efficient. So we have been talking about it, and we will also do a brief review in this chapter. So if there is no market failure, the market system is, you can put it that the market system is a best way of managing an economy. Why? Because it maximizes the total surplus. Now here comes the issue of externality. It's one type of market failure. So market fails to consider this negative or impact that the market is causing. For example, if you take the market for gasoline, so there is the producers of gasoline, and then there is a consumer, and there is a equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. But what externality says is that they does not consider the environmental pollution that results from consuming gasoline. So that's one externality, and market basically fails to consider this when it says like it's a good system of managing the economy. So it's a market failure. Why? Because the market does not care about the negative effect of selling and consuming gasoline. So that's one drawback of market system. And in this chapter we will see how we can, or how the government can internalize the externality, that is to say that how government could solve this issue. So that's why externality is called the market failure, because the market fails to consider the negative effects of an economic activity, which might or which will affect other bystanders or those who are not directly involved in this transaction. For example, in the transaction of buying oil and consuming oil or gasoline, the other population is being affected by the pollution of air. So the market has failed to account for this pollution aspect of this market activity. So uncompensated impact of one person's action on the well-being of a bystander. Whenever we are talking about externality, it's basically the person who is not involved in this transaction, but someone who is a bystander, who is someone like a normal person living in a country, or it could be a neighbor or any other person who is not directly involved in this transaction. So externalities, there are two types. It could be a negative externality, or it could be a positive externality. A negative externality impact on the impact on the bystander is adverse. So negative externality has a negative impact on the bystander. To put it in a simple word, the bystander is negatively affected by this economic transaction. On the other hand is the positive externality, and it is impact on the bystander is beneficial. So there are also transactions or economic activities which is beneficial for a bystander. It can help someone who is not directly involved in the transaction. So externality could be positive and negative. One example of positive externality is, for example, when most of the people of a country is educated. So this education help, for example, reduce the crime rate in the country. And if everyone goes to a university or everyone is well educated, that will result in a positive externality, which is to say that it will affect the society in a positive way. So what happens is that self-interested buyers and sellers, they neglect the external cost or benefits of their actions. In a typical transaction, mostly the producer, they consider their own profit, and the buyer, they consider their own profit or their own satisfaction from the consumption of that good. And what happens is that they fail to account for the negative effect that their transaction or this activity might have on the general public or on the bystanders. So because this bystander is negatively or even positively affected by such transaction, that's why the market outcome in an economic activity which has externalities is not efficient. We will talk about this more in the coming slides, but wherever you see that there is a market failure, that there is externality, then the previous market efficiency concept are not applicable. Why? Because we do not only consider the surplus of producer and consumer, but we should also consider the effect that this transaction has on both on the bystanders. So that's why in a market in which there is externalities, the market outcome is not efficient, and that requires some policies from the government side to turn this market inefficiency to an efficient level. And we will talk about this in coming slides. So government action can sometimes improve the market outcome by addressing the issues of externality. Why? Because markets are sometimes they fail to allocate resources efficiently, and externality is also such a case. And we will also talk about how government policies can potentially improve the market allocation. And we will also talk about what kind of policies are likely to work best. So a few points that we will discuss. There's Ask the Expert question, which is about vaccines. So it's quite relevant at the current time. The main idea is that if you receive the vaccine or if you vaccinate yourself, the vaccine does not only protect you, but it also protects other citizens of the country. So by vaccinating yourself, you basically you are creating a positive externality for the community as a whole. And as you see, most of the economists they agree to this concept. They think like if someone does not get the vaccine, it results in a negative externality, and almost all the economists who answered this question, they agree to this concept. In this slide, we will talk about some of the negative externalities, example of some of the negative externalities. And in the book, you will also might have noticed these examples. One example is the air pollution from a factory. So if a factory is producing different products, they do not account for the air pollution that they are causing. Another example is the neighbor's dog, which is barking, so that also affects you in such a way that, for example, you cannot sleep well or whatsoever. And also loud music from your neighbors, construction noises, and also the second-hand smoke if you are around people who are smoking, so that also negatively affects your health, so that's a negative externality. And also using your cell phone while you are driving, so this action basically increases the road accidents for others as well. So this one also results in a negative externality. Okay, there is a quick review of the welfare economics, and that will help us to see why externalities are inefficient and how government policies could turn these inefficient markets into efficient or optimum levels. So a quick review of welfare economics. The demand curve shows the private value, how much individual value that product. In this case, it's the market for gasoline. And the supply shows the private cost. So what is the cost for the firms to supply the gasoline? And the typical way is that there is a equilibrium quantity, which is 25, and an equilibrium price of 2.5. And in this case, because the market is in equilibrium, so the market equilibrium maximizes the consumer and producer surplus, so the total surplus in this case is maximized. Now consider that we should also account for the external cost, that is the air pollution caused by supplying gasoline to the consumer. So external cost is the value of the negative impact on bystanders. So if a company is selling gasoline, and then you put a price on how much this consumption or selling of the gasoline affects a bystander, that will be the external cost. For example, 1 gallon of gasoline consumption in this example will cost $1 of external cost. So any gallon of gasoline which is consumed, that also has $1 of external cost. That could be the value of the damage happened to the air, for example, or it's just a price tag for the polluting the air. So what happens is that this $1 per gallon is a external cost, and that adds to the supply cost. So when we add this $1, as you can see in the green line, that's basically the social cost of polluting the air in this market, and that includes the private cost as well the external cost of producing gasoline. So this new line is the social. So this new line considers both private cost, which is the cost of production or the cost of supply, and then plus the external cost, that's for example the price tag put on the air pollution. So as a result, the supply curve, which is also the cost curve, shifts to the right, to the left, or moves upward in this case. And if we see that in relation to the demand curve, then what happens is that the socially optimum quantity is 20 gallons. So now you see the new socially optimum quantity, which is 20 gallons, not 25 gallons as was the case in the previous slide. Why? Because now we also consider the external cost of producing gasoline, which is the air pollution. So at any point less than amount of the socially optimum quantity, which is 20 euro, what happens is that the value of additional gas exceeds social cost. So for example, when we see the quantity, if only 10 gallons of gasoline is produced in this case, any additional production of gasoline, people value that more than the damage happening to the environment, for example, to put it in a simple word. So they, even if they consider the damage that is happening to the environment, they will still value the gasoline more. So that's why the market will produce more gasoline. And any point above the social optimum level has a higher social cost as compared to the benefit. So in that case, it will make sense to reduce the production, so the social cost is lower. Why? Because the social cost is much more higher for individual or for the society as a whole than the benefit that we are receiving from it. So both of these points are inefficient. So in this case, the market equilibrium, which was 25 units, is greater than the social optimum level, which is 25 units. So that means, like, if the production of gasoline is reduced, that will be better for the society as a whole. And one solution of reducing the production of gasoline is to impose a tax of $1 per gallon of gasoline, which has the same effect of considering the social cost of gasoline consumption. So far we have calculated the social optimum level, and in order to make the social optimal level work, one way is to impose a tax on the sellers. What the tax does is that the tax will discourage consumption, and as a result the new equilibrium will also match with the new optimum level, which also considers the social cost. So the next concept is internalizing the externality. It's basically altering incentives so that people take into account the external effect of their actions. So internalizing the externality means that people consider their behavioral which has a negative or positive impact on the society, so they also consider these externalities while they are considering their own actions. For example, this $1 tax per gallon of gasoline that will make the sellers also to account for the social cost. So they also, by taxing them, they are more socially responsible for the negative impact that the gasoline production has on the environment. And if the market participants consider their social cost, then the market equilibrium will also be the same as the social optimum level. Here are some examples of positive externalities. So as we said, positive externalities has a favorable impact or favorable benefit for the bystanders. For example, getting vaccinated on different diseases. It also affects the other people of the society, so that's something positive, or it's a positive externality. The next example is about research and development, which creates knowledge, and that knowledge would indirectly also benefit other people in the country. And also, as we talked earlier, as the level of education of the population increases, that also has a positive externality on the bystander or on the whole member of a society. So when considering positive externality, the social value of a good is also included, and that is the private value that the individual person receives, and that's the direct benefit and that the buyer receives, but they also consider the external benefit, and that's the value that of the positive impact on the bystanders. The social value of a good, the same as we talked about the cost of the social optimum level, it includes the individual or the private value, and it also includes the external benefit, so the value that a bystander will receive. And the new socially optimal quantity will also maximizes the welfare. Why? Because we consider the external effects of our economic activity, and then we consider and then we correct for that. So this new equilibrium will be also a welfare maximizing equilibrium. If we consider the positive externality or the value that has on a bystander. Yeah, so at any lower quantity, the social value of additional unit exceeds their cost. So that's why there is also always an incentive from the government side of view, point of view, to increase the quantity of those activities which has a positive externalities, such as education. And most of the government, they subsidize universities and research center because that has a positive externality on the whole society. Yeah, and in this case, the cost is lower as compared to the social value of these policies. We can also do the same analysis for the positive externality as we did for the negative externality, and this active learning is one example. And as you can see here, the social value includes the private value and plus the external benefit, which is $10 in this example for getting a vaccine shot. So as you can see that the socially optimum quantity is 25 shots, and that's more than the market equilibrium, which was 20 shots. So one way to achieve this socially optimum level is to internalize this externality by subsidizing vaccines. For example, each person would receive $10 if they vaccinate themselves, and as a result, more people will be ready to vaccinate themselves, and that will increase the market welfare in general. Okay, to put the effect of externalities in summary, if there is negative externality, market quantities are larger than the socially desirable. And if there is positive externality, the market quantity is smaller than the socially desirable, as we have seen in the case of gasoline example and also the last example about the vaccine shots. So what we can do to remedy these issues, as we said earlier, we can internalize these externalities. One way of doing is to tax goods with negative externality and subsidize the goods which has a positive externality. I will skip this vaccine example. In this topic, we will talk about public policies toward externalities. So what government could do to remedy or to consider both negative and positive externalities. One way is command and control policies, and this way the government regulates the behavior directly. So the government imposes laws and regulation which directly commands the producer or consumer to take a specific action. For example, government could limit the quantity of pollution emitted for each factory, or government could also require each firm to adopt a particular technology to reduce emission. The other public policy tools is to find a market-based policies or to propose market-based policy solution. How these market-based policies work is the government give incentives so that private decision makers will choose to solve the problem by their own. So government basically give a positive incentive or a support for those producers or for those companies which they would themselves solve the problem of externality. One way of doing this is through corrective taxes and subsidies, and the other one is tradable pollution permits. We will talk about both of them in the coming slides. In a corrective tax and subsidy, it's also called the Pigovian taxes. Pigo was one of the economists who proposed this concept. So in this concept, it induces private decision makers to take account of the social cost that arise from a negative externality. So the private decision maker, they consider or they take account of the social cost that they are imposing, and then they try to reduce this negative externality. One way of doing is to put a price tag on the right to pollute. So every country, every company, for example, they have to pay a specific amount of tax to the government if they pollute the air or water by a specific amount. And what happens in this case is that those companies which has the lower cost of reducing the pollution, they will reduce their pollution, and that also such tax will also generate revenue for the government, and it will also enhance the market efficiency. Why? Because these firms, they also say that, okay, my production of specific good also has this negative externalities, and I have to consider these negative externalities while I'm producing for that. And then they try to lower these pollutions, and one way that the government could incentivize is that the government imposes taxes. So when they are producing or when they are polluting the air at a higher level, they also have to pay taxes, and that's one incentive that they will try to reduce their pollution. And all this concept of correctiveness taxes is basically that if there is, for example, a tax on the air pollution, what happens is that those companies which has the lower cost of reducing the pollution, they will reduce their pollution at a higher rate as compared to another company which has a higher cost of reducing the pollution. As a result, the total pollution will stay the same, but what happens is that the company for which it, to put it in a simple word, is much more easier to reduce pollution, that company will reduce the pollution much greater as compared to those for whom it's a bit expensive or difficult. Yeah, so the efficient outcome will be that firms with the lowest abatement cost reduce pollution the most. So a pollution tax is efficient. Why? Because firm with low abatement cost will reduce pollution to reduce their tax burden. And firms with higher abatement cost have greater willingness to pay. So as I said before, those with a lower cost, they will reduce their pollution because they want to escape the extra taxes that the government is imposing. But on the other hand, those firms which cannot reduce their pollution, they are willing to pay much more taxes. So they will continue to pollute the air, but at the same time they will pay the taxes. And if these two companies, for example, trade this pollution permits, then even if the government has put a specific limit on the pollution, this concept will still work, and as a result, that will be an efficient outcome. So the author argues that corrective taxes are better for the environment. Why? Because it gives firms incentive to continue reducing pollution as long as the cost of doing so is less than the tax. So if the companies, they have to consider their externalities, what happens is that if the government specifies that each firm can, for example, pollute 50 tons of waste, then once each firm reaches this point, they have no further incentive to reduce further. But if there is a corrective tax system, they can still save by reducing their pollution in such that they have to pay lower taxes. For example, if there is a much cleaner technology, then they will shift to this technology in order to escape the pollution tax. I will also escape the case study in this expert part. Also this active learning. Okay, the next topic is public policy toward externalities. In this book, the author recommends one way of reducing externality is tradable pollution permit system. Using this system, the pollution will reduce at lower cost than the regulation. As we have discussed before, firms with lower cost of reducing pollution do so and sell their unused permits to other firms. And firms which has the higher cost of reducing pollution, they buy the permits. As a result, the pollution reduction is concentrated among those firms with the lowest cost. So if there is a tradable pollution permit system, the firm which has the lowest cost of reducing, they will reduce their pollution, and they will sell their unused pollution permits to those firms for whom reducing the pollution is much more expensive. So by trading these pollution permits, the level of the pollution will still be controlled, and what happens is that those firms which has lower cost of reducing pollution, they will reduce their pollution much more higher as compared to those for whom it's much more difficult. So in both cases, the firms pay for their pollution, and in case of corrective taxes, they pay for the tax to the government. But if there are pollution permits, they will buy to the owners of these permits. So in this case, that will be the company that they are buying these permits from. And the author mentions this example that some people, they condemn the way economists find a solution to the environment, and you can read it in the book yourself, and then you can decide, or you can have your own idea about it. But the main idea is that people face trade-off. So the author says, like, we cannot stop all the pollution, but we have to see the opportunity cost, and then we have to reduce our pollution in the area which is much more easier, for example, or which has a lower cost. And yeah, about the environment, it's a normal good, and it has a positive income and elasticity, which means that richer countries, they can afford a cleaner environment, and they also have tough environmental protection laws as compared to the poor countries. And economists, they see air and clean water as another normal good in the market, and they see that the demand and supply, the law of demand and supply, basically can solve this problem. There are different private solutions to the externalities, for example, moral codes and social sanction, charities, and self-interest of the relevant parties. And one way is also to integrate different businesses to reduce externalities, and there is one example of beekeeping and apple production in the book that you can read yourself. The last topic before we close is the cost theorem. According to this theory, is that if private parties can bargain without cost over the allocation of resources, they can solve the problem of externalities on their own. So if there is no bargaining cost of allocation of resources, private parties can also solve this problem of externalities between themselves, and that's according to the cost theory. And it doesn't matter what the initial distribution of right is, so in any case this cost theorem will work, and both parties can reach an agreement. And there is an example also in the book about the neighbor's dog that you can read yourself. And according to this theory, everyone is better off, and the outcome is also efficient if the private parties they come to a agreement between themselves. And I will skip this example, you can read it yourself in the book. One reason is that why private solution is not always working is because of the high transaction cost, and it's difficult for a huge number of people to agree and coordinate their decisions and activity. So that's one drawback of the cause. Okay, to summarize this chapter, whenever there is a transaction happening between a buyer and seller, a third party could possibly be affected, and that effect is called externality. This externality could be negative, which has an adverse effect on the bystander, such as pollution, or it could be a positive effect or a positive externality, which will benefit the bystander. And government can implement policies which will remedy these externalities. One way is to regulate the behavior of individual or companies. The second way is to impose corrective taxes, that is to say, to internalize the externality. Another option is to issue pollution permits, for example. And we also talked about the cost theorem, and it says that if people could bargain without cost, they can always reach an agreement in which resources are allocated efficiently. But the only drawback is that it's difficult for interested parties to reach an agreement with each other, and then there is a cost of, and that includes a bargaining cost, or that has a cost in it. So that's why